Welcome to Collective Protest and Rebellion, a Black Study intensive by the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics at the University of Pittsburgh. It's here where we consider the proposition that art and poetry and radical writing are revolutionary acts. For certain, it's when we practice in the creative mind that we access a reality unknown to us otherwise. Likewise, it's in the experience of visual art, music, dance, film, narrative, and poetry where our interior spaces are altered, allowing us to enter the world as more compassionate, empathetic beings. We borrow from Fred Moten's notion of study when he says, "We are committed to the idea that study is what you do with other people. It's walking, talking, working, dancing, suffering, some irreducible convergence of all three held under the name of speculative practice." We come together differently now. But so many of us were compelled to enter physical space after weeks of pandemic isolation after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Those protests are Black study. Black study is a deep engagement with others. It's stepping outside of your comfort zone with the kind of courage, as Cornel West says, that looks unflinchingly at catastrophic circumstances and realizes virtues like love and hope and faith. We need speculative practice in order to reach outside of the intolerable and intractable present toward the future we deserve. We are excited to be in community with you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Angie Cruz, and I'm faculty affiliate at the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics, CAP, at the University of Pittsburgh, and a professor in the writing program, where I teach fiction.
And I'm Dawn Lundy Martin. I'm the director of CAP and also a professor in the writing program where I teach poetry. We are so happy that you can join us for what promises to be an extraordinary evening with renowned poet, novelist, and essayist Dionne Brand, and acclaimed poet and literary scholar Harryette Mullen.
And what a treat! I'm actually so excited. The conversational part of the evening will be moderated by Emily Greenwood, whose work intersects classics and Black studies.
She gave a really mind-blowing talk this afternoon. You can actually check it out because it's on Crowdcast and it's also on our YouTube channel.
This is CAP's Black Study Intensive with the theme Collective Protest and Rebellion.
It's where community members, students, and faculty can all study together on equal ground.
Okay, tonight's event is titled These Tyrannical Times, Poetry as Liberatory, Poetry as Undoing. Both Dionne Brand and Harryette Mullen stretch the boundaries of language, itself an act of resistance, contributing to the new meaning making from the inner landscape to the outer landscape. We are so grateful to everyone who made this evening possible.
Each writer will read for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then Emily Greenwood will engage them in conversation. A Q&A will follow. Feel free to use the chat function so you can join in the conversation at any time. Ask questions by using the Ask a Question button. Make sure you do that. Ask questions, join the chat. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, we want to see you in the chat. Anything you want to say, we're so excited to hear it.
We are pleased to welcome Dionne Brand, followed by Harryette Mullen.
Thank you, Dawn Lundy Martin, for this wonderful invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to meet and think with Harryette Mullen, whose work I deeply admire. I look forward to our conversation with Emily Greenwood. I will read from my book, Ossuaries. It needs nothing by way of introduction except perhaps that time in the poem is in a future present. Ossuary. I lived and loved, some might say, in momentous times. Looking back, my dreams were full of prisons. In our narcotic drifting slumbers, so many dreams, of course, were full of prisons. Mine were without relief. In our induced days and our wingless days, my every waking was incarcerated. Each square meter of air so toxic with violence. The atmospheres were breathless there. The bronchial trees were ligatured with carbons. Some damage I had expected, but no one expects the violence of glances, of offices, of walkways and train stations, of bathroom mirrors, especially the vicious telephones, the coarseness of daylight, the brusque decisions of air, the casual homicides of dresses. What brutal hours, what brutal days. Do not say, oh, find the good in it. Do not say, there was virtue. There was no virtue, not even in me. Let us begin from there. Restraining metals covered my heart. Rivulets of some unknown substance transfused my veins. At night, especially at night, it is always at night, a wall of concrete enclosed me. It was impossible to open my eyes. I lived like this, as I said, without care. Tanks rolled into my life. Grenades took root in my uterus. I was sickly each morning. So dearly, what to say? Life went on around me. I laughed. I had drinks. I gathered with friends. We grinned our aluminum teeth. We exhaled our venomous breaths. We tried to be calm in the invisible architecture. We incubated like cluster bombs, whole lives waiting, whole stellar regions, discoveries of nebulae and compassion. From the cities, the electric rains pierced us. The ceaseless bitter days folded like good linen. The phosphorus streets gave off their harmful lights. I loved and lived, as I said, for a time, looking up from water like seashells. I arrived where the sonorous oceans took me, washed and washed. Coral overcame my feet, my hands, the shocks of immobilities, the stung tendons, the clamped Achilles, the enamel vocal cords. I did well, they say. Given the circumstances, the spiked municipalities rationed their handouts of free breads, free bicycles, free bracelets, free sugars, free plastics, free razor blades, free bullets, free coverings, free enclosures, free fences, free, absolutely freeness. Still, they required performances. One needed licenses and stamped forms and masks and stickers and, worst of all, transparent veins. To be frank, most of my time was spent sleeping in one courthouse or another, defending charges of one thing or another, larcenies, robberies, trespassing, loitering, intimidation, vagrancy, resisting arrest, but fundamentally, existence. I took my case everywhere, naturally, all continents, several unknown galaxies, some as yet unarmed moons, Needless to say, nameless to count the prodigious silence, the thunderclaps of salutary ignorance. So, as I said, momentous, ravenous, ugly times. I'm aware how this looks, like pins and fractile glass, and after a time anyone could see the futile jurisdictions in all my waterlogged paper. Lived and loved. Common oxymoron. If I have lived, I have not loved. And if I have loved, I cannot have lived. It was difficult to live and love at the same time. You see what I mean? Since to live is to be rapacious as claws, to have the most efficient knives and broken beer bottles, needles, powers of attorney, nonchalance, indifference, negligence. To love is an impediment to this hard business of living, so I cannot have loved, not me. Do not think this of me. Do not think I did not try to breach the fluorescent streets to admit the long disillusioned sandbanks. Do not think it. I rented secretive rooms to see what it was like. No denying, I spread prickling sheets on narrowing beds, stretched out beside one person and then another, the night dew we collected at our throats, cackling. The cardamom aroma of our breaths, the cinnamon we rubbed in our hands before touching, the basil leaves with which we covered ourselves, obviously, my rainy, rainy eyes, my earth-filled hair, all this I brought across sticky bitumen highways to the dim, lit, ambiguous approaches of these stanzas, their permanences, their impermanences we wore in our heavy, heavy coats. The dried lavender flowers I crushed in my palms before opening the doors, my coastal limbs carrying shells and seaweed, the full ocean in my mouth. Oh, I longed for the deepest, suicidal blue waters. I craved the seas where what was on earth could not scar me. I gave all these to lovers. I gave them to my glasses. We looked through windows from hotels or freeways, off the industrial parks, off garbage dumps. We saw demolitions that stung our eyes roomy. Indefinable liquids pass through our indefinable souls. Here I am then. Goodbye. And again, how we left those rooms fully clothed, twigs and branded bones. Do not say it was my fault. Do not say I could have gathered blue dragonflies or the showering sunlight, the ashes of volcanoes or the residue of songs from the cups of saxophones. I could not have raised ferned cadavers, thistles, and thurium horses. Could not. I tried love. I did. The scapulae I kissed. I did. The flat triangular bones I filled with kisses. Spumes of kisses, gutters of kisses, postponed kisses, and early newborn kisses. The curve of clavicles. I dug artesian wells of kisses there. Utensils of kisses, spoons of kisses, basins of kisses, creeks of kisses. The jugular notch I ate in kisses. I devoured in kisses. Teeth-filled kisses, throat-filled, gullet stuffed. So don't tell me how love will rescue me. I was carnivorous about love. I ate love to the ankles. My thighs are gnawed with love. Still and yet, I cannot have loved, since living was all I could do. And for that, I was caged in bone spur endlessly. Eye sockets ambushed me. I slept with harassments and provocations, though I wanted to grow lilacs. Who wouldn't? To know the secret of spiders. Who wouldn't? Yet the rumors of newspapers persisted. The pained sighs of the waiting rooms of existence were called good music. I could not leave my house without plans. A perfect stranger's thought and bone would sprout on my heart like a lantern trapping a light. If only I could tell you something from here, some good thing that would weather the atmospheres. I would put it in an envelope, send it to my past life, where someone would open it and warn the world, though this news would arrive corroded. You would still read it, its rust blooding, its oxygen asperous and brittle. I'd hope you would still understand it from here, what and how I'd been wasted. To feel the mouth full like drowning, the lungs like pinned butterflies, and then as if the heart were eaten out, cord, this would do you no good. To hear that from one January to the next, nothing happened much that was not the same. Arteries of stone, capillaries of desolate cement, and no kisses. Rather, I should say nothing, leave you to it. Make your own vain flights. See how it goes. I can't tell time anyway. What is the sense then in sending this envelope, porous as it is? Don't worry. Look out. That's all it will say. But go on. Go on. The brilliant future doesn't wait. Forget this. Thank you.
Oh my, Dionne Brand, if you could see the thunderous applause that's happening on Crowdcast, you would be wowed. I am wowed by that reading. Thank you very much. Earlier in Emily's talk, she talked about dehumanizing knowledge, and she also talked how some knowledge is dehumanizing, and she also talked about how language makes us human. And I just want to say that anytime I encounter your work, I feel more uniquely alive.
Oh,
it's really beautiful. Thank you so much. I love the way that you write in such a complicated way about love. So we're very grateful to
thank you so much
for your being here.
Thank you.
Up next is Harryette Mullen, who I encountered many, many years ago as a young poet and a young scholar, but then got the privilege of meeting at the Cave Canem retreat for African-American poets. And all of you here, or many of you here, probably already know what a brilliant poet and thinker Harryette Mullen is. But back then, when we were at Cave Canem in upstate New York at an old monastery, I also discovered what a generous person and with such a big heart she is. She would let us into her dorm room at all hours of the night and have conversations with us about poetry. Harryette Mullen is one of those poets who helped me discover how elastic and playful language can be. And there's something to me that's really revolutionary about that. I am honored to welcome Harryette Mullen.
Well, I'm very honored to be here with you, Dawn Lundy Martin, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this conversation. And I thank the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics and the University of Pittsburgh for allowing me to join this wonderful company. So I thought I would begin with a poem from just a very brief poem from my book Trimmings, which is also collected in Recyclopedia. Her red and white, white and blue banner manner. Her red and white, all over black and blue. Hannah's bandana flagging her down in the kitchen with Dinah. With Jemima, someone in the kitchen I know. And then I wanted to read several poems from Sleeping with the Dictionary. This is a book that I wrote some time ago, but some of these poems seem to continue to have resonance. Sometimes that is actually not so heartening that they continue to have resonance. This poem is called Denigration. Did we surprise our teachers who had niggling doubts about the picayune brains of small Black children who reminded them of clean pickaninnies on a box of laundry soap? How muddy is the Mississippi compared to the third longest river of the darkest continent? In the land of the Igbo, the Hausa, and the Yoruba, what is the price per barrel of negrescence? Those slaves who were wealth survived on niggardly provisions. Should inheritors of wealth fault the poor enigma for lacking a dictionary? Does the mayor demand a recount of every ballot? Does the mayor demand a recount of every bullet? Or does City Hall simply neglect the Black alderman's district? If I disagree with your beliefs, do you chalk it up to my negligible powers of discrimination, supposing I'm just trifling and not worth considering? Does my niggling concern with trivial matters negate my ability to negotiate in good faith? Though Maroons, who were unruly Africans, not loose horses or lazy sailors, were called renegades in Spanish, will I turn any blacker if I renege on this deal? This next poem is elliptical, and that refers to the three dots, but also it refers to something that is defective. Something is missing. They just can't seem to. They should try harder to. They ought to be more. We all wish they weren't so. They never. They always. Sometimes they. Once in a while they. However, it is obvious that their overall tendency has been, the consequences of which have been, they don't appear to understand that, if only they would make an effort to, but we know how difficult it is for them to. Many of them remain unaware of. Some who should know better simply refuse to. Of course, their perspective has been limited by. On the other hand, they obviously feel entitled to. Certainly, we can't forget that they, nor can it be denied that we know that this has had an enormous impact on their. Nevertheless, their behavior strikes us as our interactions, unfortunately, have been. So now I'm going to read Exploring the Dark Content, or you could say Exploring the Dark Content. This dream is not a map. A poem is not the territory. The dreamer reclines in a barbershop carpeted with Afro turf. In the dark, some soul yells. It hurts to walk barefoot on cowrie shells. This is a longer prose poem. It's called Resistance is Fertile. This system needs your moral fiber like a bowl of X-brand flakes. If your kind cannot be assimilated to make spare parts for Borg wars, your resistance challenges the ant farm to adapt. You might think the system's tone deaf, but our software's immune. You are the virus that keeps it in tune. We are the tolerant host, which makes you the guest worker colony of E. coli, the chitlins inside the chitlins. Catching hits off our perfect pitch, your contra fits a false note passed through the phony caca. We call you irresponsible, say you're indigestible, and it's undeniably true. It's tough to swallow you. Your data resisted analysis, but if you are not consumed, your flawed construction only proves that we are perfection cubed. Did you need to read the label on Olean to know the SOS goes out when the chip's going down? To Cuisinart our metaphors once again, let's just say that Dracula's liquid protein diet could use some roughage to help with his next smooth move. A bloodsucker's got to worry about irregularity, so pollsters press the pulse, take specimens of the blood count. Pundits poo-poo as law and order candidate Bruce Wayne leaves his potty to go on a turd pooty ticket. Libertarian runs on a vowel movement platform. The result will be a better grade of guano piling up in the bat cave. Our constipation requires frequent amendments to feed the tree of liberty. Can you dig it? Can you dig it? Man, you're digging it with a shovel. When you're all pooped out, we're just breaking a second wind. This poem I'm reading next, We Are Not Responsible. Wait a minute, I think I skipped one I was going to read. I think I'll read present tense, yes. Now that my ears are connected to a random answer machine, the wrong brain keeps talking through my hat. Now that I've been licked all over by the English tongue, my common law spout is suing for divorce. Now that the Vatican has confessed and the White House has issued an apology, I can forgive everything and forget nothing. Now the overdrawn credits roll as the bankrupt star drives a patchwork cab to the finished line, where a broke robot waves a mended tablecloth, which is the stale flag of a checkmate career. Now that the history of civilization has been encrypted on a medium grain of rice, it's taken the starch out of the stuffed shorts. Now, as the voice of America crackles and fades, the market reports that today the euro hit a new low. Now, as the reel unravels, our story unwinds with the curious dynamic of an action flick without a white protagonist. Okay, so now I think I'm going to read We Are Not Responsible. We are not responsible for your lost or stolen relatives. We cannot guarantee your safety if you disobey our instructions. We do not endorse the causes or claims of people begging for handouts. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. Your ticket does not guarantee that we will honor your reservations. In order to facilitate our procedures, please limit your carrying on. Before taking off, please extinguish all smoldering resentments. If you cannot understand English, you will be moved out of the way. In the event of a loss, you better look out for yourself. Your insurance was canceled because we can no longer handle your frightful claims. Our handlers lost your luggage, and we are unable to find the key to your legal case. You were detained for interrogation because you fit the profile. You are not presumed to be innocent if the police have reason to suspect you are carrying a concealed wallet. It's not our fault you were born wearing a gang color. It is not our obligation to inform you of your rights. Step aside, please, while our officer inspects your bad attitude. You have no rights that we are bound to respect. Please remain calm, or we can't be held responsible for what happens to you. And I'm going to read two more. Why You and I. Who knows why you and I fell off the roster? Who can figure why you and I never passed muster on our way out yonder? Does anyone wonder why you and I lacked the presence of minding our blunders? Can anyone see why you and I, no longer intact, pulled a disappearing act and left with scratch? Our secret pact required that you and I forget why and where we lost our place when we went off the books. Could anyone guess? Does anyone know or even care why you and I can't be found as hard as we look? Who'll spell out for us, if we exist, why you and I missed our turn on the list? Who can stand to reason why you and I let our union dissolve to strike the orderly alphabet? And I'm going to end with Wino Rhino. This was inspired partly because I do walk around on the streets of Los Angeles, and that gives you a different point of view than when you're driving. For no specific reason, I have become one of the city's unicorns. No rare species, but one in range of danger. No mythical animal, but a common creature of urban legend. No potent stallion woven into poetry and song, just a tough, horny beast you may observe roaming at large in our habitat. I'm known to adventurers whose drive-by safari is this circumscribed wilderness. Denatured photographers like to shoot me, tipping the bottle, capture me, snorting dust, mount on the wall my horn of empties that spilled the grape's blood. My flesh crawls with itchy insects. My heart quivers as arrows on street maps target me for urban removal. You can see that my hair's stiffened and my skin's thick, but the bravest camera can't document what my armor hides. How I know you so well, why I know my own strength. Why, when I charge you with my rags, I won't overturn your sporty Jeep. Thank you.
Wow. Oh, Harryette, thank you so much. I said elasticity when it comes to language, but I think I meant something like how the language is like, you give us like the flip side, how it flips the script, or there's a kind of hilarious darkness, or like when you encounter a poisonous toad and you flip it over and its belly is filled with diamonds. And I love that moment. It's kind of like, you know, what Kathleen Fraser talks about in terms of the accident where you misspoke and said ballot instead of bullet. How apropos. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. What a gorgeous reading. It's always an honor. Now I will welcome back to our space for conversation Dionne Brand and Emily Greenwood, who will moderate this conversation. She's a Yale professor whose work intersects classics and Black studies. And again, if you have not were not able to make her talk earlier, it was inspiring, and I found it very moving. So it will be on the Crowdcast. So please welcome Emily to the room, and I will leave and hand it over to you.
Hi, Dionne Brand, Harryette Mullen. In Greek, a myriad is 10,000. Now, we're not quite 10,000 in this event, but we're over 1,000. And I know that I could go to the ends of language in praise of your readings and what your work means so many to so many of us. And there would still be people out there who would be mad and thinking that I had sold you short. So let me just say that that was ineffably piercing and wonderful. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to start with a couple of questions. that acknowledge the context of our being here for this week of intensive Black study. And our theme for this evening is These Tyrannical Times, Poetry as Liberatory, Poetry as Undoing. Dionne, perhaps I could start by asking you, your poetry and your prose was a very prominent source of inspiration for Christina Sharp's 2016 book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being. And there, Sharp uses your phrase, sitting in the room with history, to think through the conditions of Black being in the Americas, in the wake and in the hold of history. In one of the poems from Ossuaries that you read to us, the narrator locates their experience in these momentous times. But you've reminded us throughout all of your work that our momentous times in the Americas are volcanoes, volcanoes of empire, of colonialism, of slavery, and of genocide. So I wanted to ask you how you're thinking and feeling about the work of poetic expression in these very particular momentous times that we're in now.
Thank you, Emily, for the question. You know, I think that I work as a poet within, I'm lucky to work within a kind of the tradition of revolutionary poetry. And that tradition encompasses, you know, the movements including like negritude or anti-colonial poetry, anti-imperialist poetry, the Pan-African movement, the poetry that came out of that, the Black Arts movement, and it encompasses like, you know, Caribbean poetry, African-American, African, Latin American poetry. So my teachers have been people like, you know, Leopold Sedar Senghor, David Diop of that negritude movement, and Aimé Césaire, or Nicolas Guillen, for example, or Langston Hughes, Grace Nichols, Sonia Sanchez, Nikki Giovanni, just an amazing tradition, I feel, that responds to the catastrophe of chattel slavery. You know, Robert Hayden, Taban Lo-Leong, Okut Pibitek, Dennis Brutus. I mean, I can go on and on and on, you know, Kamau Brathwaite, June Jordan, Audre Lorde. Like I'm carrying them with me, and they too practiced a revolutionary poetry, a poetry that met with the times, yeah? These several hundred years of our oppression. This poetry of theirs called me in its expansiveness and its agility and its intellectual depth. And this is a poetry that is in constant and close and dynamic contention with violent ruling and violent language. Yeah, it is a poetry that works in the kind of heat of meaning making. You know, I was listening to Harryette and thinking, whoa, I love those leaps. You know what I mean? And that is significant of the kind of poetry that we've produced, yeah, post Columbus, yeah. And also it's joined with this great musical utterance too, yeah, jazz, blues, calypso. So in this kind of moment, I think of that production of utterances against that regime, yeah, against that violence that was inaugurated by the catastrophe of chattel slavery, and its ongoing practice, yeah. So this moment, this particular one, is a station in the long durée of those momentous times that tradition comes out of. And so that is how I feel my work works. That's how I want it to work. Am I making sense?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. But talking too long though. But okay, go ahead.
We're here to hear, both of you. Thank you. So if I could ask a similar question to Harryette. You shared 8 poems with us from Sleeping with the Dictionary, published in 2002. And if I'm thinking, Dionne has just spoken about the tradition in the Americas in which you write. If I'm thinking about the significance of Sleeping with the Dictionary in the American tradition, I think about the dictionary as a gateway to literacy and as a tool of autodidacticism for slaves, former slaves like Frederick Douglass, whose beginnings had to be in fugitive study. So you presented or framed the dictionary for us in that collection as both a tool of liberation, but as also a sort of controlling and limiting authority. That poem, "We are not responsible," with that line that is so supercharged with history. Let me read it. "Your ticket does not guarantee that we will honor your reservations." Could you talk to us a little bit more about how you see the dictionary and the whole science of lexicography as a tool of resistance?
Well, I do appreciate your question. It's a very comprehensive question, and my answer can't really be equal to it. But I would say that for a long time, I have been fascinated with dictionaries, and I actually do collect them. I have been thinking that, in many families in the past, if there was a dictionary in the house, that was the authority for how you defined a word and how you spelled a word and how you pronounced a word. And one of the things that happens when you collect dictionaries is you see that the authorities don't agree among themselves. So one of the things that's been interesting to me is the plurality of meaning and the plurality of authority, and how authority is something that is not simply received. It is something that is being created all the time. And that when we think about language and how we are each individually and collectively implicated in language, and when we go to the dictionary to help us explicate the situations where we are in the folds of language and we are in the folds of history, the dictionary helps me to locate myself in language where the language itself is fluid and shifting, and I and my identity are also fluid and shifting. So that plurality allows me in a certain way to break the most fossilizing aspect of authority, but it also allows me to feel some sense of co-creation and co-critical authority along with the dictionary. I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me is that these sort of reference works, many of which I have piled on my desk all the time as I'm writing, we call them authorities, but we also call them companions. Often these reference works are called your companion. So that was one of the thoughts behind my title, Sleeping with the Dictionary. Because in what way am I sleeping with the enemy? In what way am I sleeping with a companion? In what way am I just bored because the dictionary put me to sleep? I found that when people talk about the title, some of them say, "Oh, that's a sexy title," because they think the dictionary is sexy. And other people say, "Oh, yeah, that's because the dictionary was so boring it put you to sleep." So that's a plurality even in how people even respond to the idea of the dictionary. But I also just wanted to briefly say how ravishing is the language, the sensuously embodied intellectual, critical, and creative practice of Dionne Brand.
Oh. No, you're gonna make me cry or something. Thank you. No.
That's how I feel.
Oh. Okay, I have to leave now.
So we're going off script, which is great because you've just spoken to us and opened up this idea of the dictionary as not just instrumental, not just a tool for liberation, not just a controlling authority, but as fundamentally unruly, that you can navigate in so many different ways. I want to stick with this theme of language and a different kind of unruliness. Dionne, you do something bold, really bold, but you do many really bold things in Ossuaries. But at one point in the first poem, roughly midway through the poem, you have one of your narrators, Yasmin, jettison verbs and tell us that we will come to see that verbs are a tragedy. Could you? And then I think in the second poem of Ossuaries, you begin by repeating the word undoing 4 times and talk about the infinitive of arrears. In the context of thinking about poetry as undoing, could you break down for us this idea of verbs as tragedy?
I wish, but I'll try. I think that poetry's major proposition is, in a sense, that it will turn language over. Yeah. That it intends to reorganize the way a thing is thought, or maybe thought. And this is the main threshold of poetry. That is its intensity and, how to make language anew. And we encounter the narrow enclosure of anti-Blackness, of racism, etc. And in that narrow enclosure, there are things done to us. And I wanted to undo that by jettisoning the verb, the doing telling word, and seeing if a set of combinations of prepositions, nouns, adjectives, adverbs could restate a world, right? So my intention was to redo that. I think like poetry is like metallurgy, if you will, to add yet another metaphor, sorry, but a practice of sort of examining the physical and chemical behavior or combinations of language itself, its microstructure, and that metallurgy in the sense of constructing through a kind of pressure, some material idea and language that I can use to live well. And that I, which I just use, exceeds the individual I. It is a kind of means by which to make something expand in the world, or to make what is really expansive present in the world, right? Because I think of those regimes as very narrow structures, really. They have very limited instructions for us. The instructions are very limited, where we exceed those instructions always. And it's that excess that they keep trying to kind of collect and put it all back together. And as I said, and I repeat, it was a way to make Black life live on and off the page, to attend to this largeness of life in language, which is something that we are always doing, right? We always have to be agile about language anyway, right? What else? In the last poem in the book, of another book of mine, Inventory, I say, there are atomic openings in my chest to hold the wounded. And this is, I think, what my task as a poet is, to kind of remake, hold and remake, hold and make, forget remake, hold and make. But to return to the tragedy of the verb, it comes out of thinking about that coloniality, that it is great power, but small enclosure, because it really only wants you to conform to a particular regime. What's outside of it is bigger. And that is what it is, even as it tries with every terrible means available to make one live in its smallness. Albeit that we are held in it, it is a narrow concept in terms of the role it assigns us, and it's bound by violence. Hence to undo and undo and undo. Yeah. You're doing 3, 4, 5 jobs all the time if you're Black in the world.
Yeah. Your writing and your speaking to us now is a demiurge. I think of all of the metaphors in the poetic tradition of the creation of worlds. So I'm going to come back to you in a few minutes and ask you about the turn to science in some of your recent poetry and the sort of elemental metaphors. Harryette, can I ask you likewise a sort of grammar language related question? You read the wonderful poem Elliptical, which just really explodes the use of the third person plural pronoun they as an ethnographic distancing device. They, these people. And I think about the sort of callous, irresponsible use of language by leaders, by CEOs who leverage histories of exploitation and yet at the same time disown the history of usage of the words they're using. And they just brings that through so strongly. Could you talk a bit, particularly to sort of students in the audience and poets who are at an earlier stage in their careers, and scholars as well, what primer would you hold out to people for thinking in the fresh ways that you do, other than your own poetry? What primer would you hold out for thinking about language and these games with grammar?
Well, I was thinking about actually in an autobiographical and at this point historical sense, books that I was reading when I was a student that changed my view of language, that in a way kind of refocused my my view about where we are in language, where we find ourselves in language, and where we think we can go in language. And some of those would include Frantz Fanon, Black Skins, White Masks, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, George Lakoff, Metaphors We Live By, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, and many, many very dense and difficult works by Sylvia Wynter. I did notice that Duke University published kind of almost a symposium or retrospective on her work that's called On Being Human as Praxis, which is a wonderful title to describe her work through her lifetime. So those were some of the writers and the books that were either assigned to me or I found them in some used bookstore, and they opened up the possibilities of language that helped me both as a writer, as a thinker, as a poet, as a student, made the world bigger and made language bigger.
Okay, thank you. So about making the world bigger, Dionne, I said I would come back to you on metallurgy and science series, and then in your current work in progress, A Nomenclature of Everything, there's a very strong turn to the languages of science, anatomy, botany, chemistry, astronomy. You're using the elements, oxygen, helium, words like tetravalence. Could you tell us what science, the language of science, enables you to do, what freedom and powers of expression it gives you, and the relationship between ecology in your recent poetry and environmental violence, and then violence as well? Where is the language of science coming in here?
Well, I think that these are everyday materials of the social now. We don't live in nature. We live in science, and that is nature in effect. And that, that bucolic turn in the European Romantics period of the, late 18th, early 19th century, that dominated modern poetry in English and still dominates it. I think that language is insufficient. And also one has to note that that language is being used at the same time that chattel slavery is going on, right? The 18th, 19th century, there's still slavery, but there are all these, all that beauty is built on slavery. Just as an aside, Robert Burns is going off to Jamaica to become an overseer. And then his first book is published, and then he says, okay, I won't go then. But this is what is going on in the material life of those poets at the time who now, from whom this history of writing about nature in a particular way comes from, right? So it seemed to me even more urgent in this moment that I say, and when I say moment, I mean the last 20, 30 years or so, to use the plain language of the lived, the chemistry of pollution, the toxic waste covering most of what we call nature, the seas saturated in oil, the sort of 900 feet platforms out in the oceans drilling, all the breaker yards for all that big equipment in many parts of the world, India, Africa, etc., and the where the environment can ill afford it, and the electronic waste now that is sort of transported millions of miles to places like Agbobloshi near Accra. Just the human waste also shipped to Mississippi. It's just, this is what we're actually living. I simply wanted to write it down so that we are not, we cannot claim to be unaware of it. This is the language that we are actually living, right? And this is nature. This is the nature we live in. All of us I don't have a cell phone because sometimes I thought I don't want to have anything to do with coltan, but I have a computer and I have so many, you know what I mean? So many bits of equipment. This is the nature we live in, the kind of bespoke plastic, bespoke rubber, the doom scroll, the dopamine stuff. I mean, so I think we should write about, what we are living, and so that becomes really clear to us, how it is underwritten by super extraction and war and maiming and death and so on. And it is the skin of our living. It has to do with our pleasures, and our desires. And then again, we are chemistry. We're sodium and magnesium and chlorine and potassium. And, the word heart means nothing to the heart. The heart is just a big valve doing this, right? So anyway, I just wanted to come back to, what a word means and how we live those words. Yeah.
You earlier evoked Aimé Césaire as a poetic ancestor, and I'm reminded of Notebook of Return to My Native Land, Césaire's use of science. I defy the craniometer, the sort of volcanic
beautiful
language. But, hearing ossuaries and the bronchioles and the toxicity, it's almost too close. It's very much with us.
Love of my life. It's one of them. Anyway.
So, and Harryette, in the midst of serious Black study, which you sustain intensively all the time, you always summon irony and play. And you read for us, resistance is fertile. The scatological takedown there of the hypocritical gap between our highest ideals and the ironies of the experience of many Americans is so astute and merciless. I want to ask you though about this composition, because when you wrote the line, our constipation requires frequent amendment to feed the tree of liberty. What was the sort of play of the writing? Were you circling your desk? Were you chuckling? Were you daring yourself to write that line? I mean, just talk us through satire and what it means to you, and how it is both a tool of analysis, but also a sustaining mode for your practice as a poet.
Well, I think one of the difficulties we have now as writers, as creative thinkers, is that political discourse is satirizing itself. That we almost don't have a room to parody and ridicule the public discourse because it has become so inherently ridiculous. I think that another problem is that satire seems to depend on having shared values. One of the things that satirists call attention to is where our shared values are being violated. And satire often has this kind of almost didactic turn where it points out these violations in what we think of as our shared value systems, which I think are becoming increasingly difficult to locate and to establish what it is that we share in common, even in terms of what is truth, what is a fact. So language has become increasingly empty, devoid of meaning. I find that to be very difficult. Of course, the line that you're talking about is a rewriting of Thomas Jefferson. He wrote that the tree, he says, what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants, if it is its natural manure. So you see that the whole poem actually leaps out of that phrase, which he was using at the time in 1787. He was talking about a rebellion, Shays' Rebellion, that took place in Massachusetts in 1786, but he could just as well be talking about now. And even his words have been used very differently across the political spectrum. I mean, those words are often taken to heart by these self-proclaimed patriots who are at war with the rest of us. And so those words are so easily turned upside down and inside out. And that's something that I call attention to in my work.
Thank you. Walcott's All That Greek Manure Under the Green Bananas, and the sort of paradoxes of grafting in these historical texts. So I know that we need to move to general Q&A. There's so much more I want to ask you, and I think that we're going to get to a lot of the questions with the audience questions. I hope we'll get to talk about your conception of the university and the place of Black study in the university and the role that poetry can play. But to end, we turn over to audience Q&A. I'd like to ask each of you, Harryette first, then Dionne, to share with us a line of the other's poetry that you find particularly salient for thinking with and living with in these times.
I couldn't help but this one leaped out from the Blue Clerk, Ars Poetica in 59 versos. I wish this would be over so I could get on with my life. The author says, how long do these centuries last? Pretty on the nose.
No translation needed.
Well, in my case, I love this big space you open up in Sleeping with the Dictionary, where the line goes, the alphabetical order of this ample block of knowledge might render a dense lexicon of lucid hallucinations. And I think that is such a big space, you know, that might just serve all of us for a long, it's the kind of thing you want to think about for a really long time. It's the kind of thing you can live in. And if we fill the space in that sentence, it allows us this massive room to live, you know, and the previous one too, about a symptomatic dictionary. Like it was really significant of, yes, we live in this symptomatic dictionary. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So we have an avalanche, a cascade, or a sort of flowering, let's say, a flowering of questions in the chat. So I'll try to sort of alternate, even though, you know, you could both equally speak to many of these questions. Harryette, we have a question about poetry and prose as media. Both of you are, you know, equally known in poetry and prose. And the question is about, can poetic language, which you embody both in poetry and prose, can it do its work as effectively in challenging the status quo in verse as it can in prose? So the balance of poetic language between poetry and prose.
Well, I think that they do different things usually. I think that sometimes our minds are a little compartmentalized, and I think our schooling, the way we're taught, often contributes to that compartmentalization. I think that probably ancient cultures were not so specialized and compartmentalized. And, you know, if you go very far back in human history, you'll find that poetry and science were not separate. The language of poetry was used for history, for science, for philosophy. And to some extent that has returned in more contemporary times. I think that for me, there's a poetics of thinking that can be both creative and critical, that allows a kind of thought that is, yes, unruly, because poetry can be governed by many rules. But one thing I tell my writing students, all of the rules of poetry can be broken. poetry has all the rules of speaking, writing. It has all the rules of all the other literary and non-literary forms of writing. It has all of the grammatical rules. But in poetry, those rules can all be broken. You arguably should break them deliberately and purposefully, and with flair, with style. But to think about what the rules are and to be actually actively, consciously selecting which rules you want to break. This is something that poetry schools us to do. It gives us practice in thinking about where are we going to break those rules so that those rules don't get in the way of our thinking.
Thank you. Thinking about rules or norms or expectations in a different sense, Dionne, we have a question about theory. And I'm glad this question is coming up because I had wanted to ask you about your 1997 collection, Land to Light On, where the narrator expresses some impatience with academic discourse and smartness, thinking that smartness is a substitute for serious study. So the question is about, can you speak about literary theory and the importance of reinventing or reframing the language of instruction around literary analysis?
That's sort of twofold. In terms of the reference in Land to Light On, where the poet talks about all of us in our smartness and so on, it was a kind of self-critique on a particular period of infantile leftism in my own practice, which was kind of brought up short by my living in Grenada in '83 during the revolution and witnessing the demise of the revolution, and then kind of questioning what I had learned and how I had deployed that learning. Yeah, and what I had learned was that study, and what that taught me was that study and practice of Black revolution may be two different things. That study is not practice, but practice is always study in some ways, right? Study comes out of practice. But also that study is a massive undertaking, and that, Black study in particular, I think, sits in this dynamic place where it is always becoming practice. Like what we do, where we teach, if those of us who teach, etc., it's always crucial matter we are producing and making, because it has a practical use, yeah, and so that the stakes of that work, the stakes of work that we are producing, are always high in the production of a theory of Black life. They're always high because they're living stakes, and they mean something immediate and profound, sometimes for millions and millions of people. So it's a really quite, such a responsibility, this undertaking of study. And I think that study exceeds universities, and it also exceeds nation for us, and it must. So that was what that was in reference to. Now I've forgotten the second half of that question.
About literary theory and the importance of reinventing or reframing the language of instruction around literary analysis. And I suppose maybe then in your writing, the extent to which that is an audience or a body of authority, a canon of authority in the realm of theory.
Yeah. Well, I'm always trying to reorganize that, I'm always trying to reorganize or eschew the taken for granted ways that we talk about learning and study, etc. And Harryette mentions Paulo Freire's work, and I'm kind of a practitioner in that way about the uses of theory, right? And as I said before, I think that theory is for us a beating practice. Do you know what I mean? It must work. Like it has to work. It cannot be, for example. Do you know what I mean? It has to work because it kind of has to work in our life. And I think in that regard, I like to read and think with work by organizers, organizers of Black struggle, right? By poets who work in that field of Black struggle, read and work with the thoughts and ideas of political prisoners. So I think for us, that institutionalization of study is a tricky position, yeah, tricky and liminal sometimes. I don't have any idea if I answered that, but that's what I got.
No, you did.
Okay.
I think it exceeded the frame of the question by making us sort of, you flip the tables on theory, and I like this idea of beating or testing, almost a touchstone to see how theory translates and what it's good for. Harryette, I can't not ask you that question because there's such a rich meta-theoretical, metacritical dimension to your work that operates on so many different levels of subtlety and difficulty, and yet maintains a sort of very open, generous contract with your reader. Could you talk to this question about literary analysis and theory and what role it plays in your poetry?
Well, I do teach literature as well as creative writing here at UCLA. And, often just even to go back a minute to the previous question about poetry and prose, I'm often actually writing with a split screen with two files open, so that sometimes when I'm writing something that's academic or critical, or even a report that I have to write, and sometimes I will have another screen open with a poem in process, a work in progress that is a poetic. And I find that because, yes, in some ways my brain is also compartmentalized, that I might have to wear out the critical voice in order to write the poem. So sometimes when I come to an impasse in some critical piece that I might be writing, or even an academic report that I'm writing, I might just switch over to the other frame. So that technology is a way of mirroring, the way that we leap back and forth in our own minds from one to the other. I happen to have lived through this whole creation of ethnic studies, Black studies, Africana studies. They did not exist when I was an undergraduate. I majored in English. It was, at the time, they called it the straight major in English, because I was not trying to teach in public schools at the time, even though my mother wanted me to take that particular path. What we read were basically, the white male canon, which is wonderful to read, but it was also quite exclusive. And as I was an undergraduate, these Black studies were emerging in the university at that point. So I lived through that. I worked through that. I studied through that. My whole academic career has been on that escalator, that development of Black studies within, because one of the things that was told that to me by Cedric Robinson, he's talked to a group of people at UC Santa Barbara where I was doing a kind of a pre-doc program. He said, you have to be aware that these institutions did not intend for us to be here. And so until you actually sort of come to terms with that fact, you're going to be blocked. I'm paraphrasing what he said, but he said, you need to be aware of that. You need to understand that. And you need to know why you're here now, because you were not meant to be here. No. You're here because of struggle. You're here because of organized struggle.
That's very, very powerful. I'm thinking back to your choice when I asked you to choose a line from Dionne's poetry, and you chose from the 2018 collection, The Blue Clerk, which experiments with that splitting of voices. So I was really struck by your idea of keeping the two files, trying to double voice the critic figure and the editor figure and the author figure, and the difficulty of keeping them apart. But yeah, so I think you've given us a really powerful answer. What we're talking about today, this whole week, is under the sign of Black study, but you also point to the limits of Black study as theory and the traditions that it comes out of. Thank you. We have so many questions. There's one that I think we really need to address because I think it will be of interest to so many people listening. And this is, the direct question: what advice can you give for aspiring writers and poets, particularly in the context of protest and rebellion? So Dionne, if I could ask that first.
Writers and poets, now that's two different kinds of things. For aspiring poets, just write, and read the tradition you are in. Yes, read everything and simply write it. It's important and it's urgent. And for those who are students and who may be out on the streets now in these days, write that life so that we and those after you could read about it. Write that life, also witness that life, and know that you have this long tradition behind too, right? And read that too, right? And I guess that would be my advice for anyone who wants to write. But we live in different worlds here. We live in capital, which has something to do with how writers produce, how writing is consumed. And that also has to be thought through, yeah? What is it you truly want to do? Is it for us, And how is it for us? Like, how will you write us? Right? And how will you make your way through all of the propaganda about us to write us? Yeah? And think that through very, very carefully. But my general advice is just read everything and just write. Write till 4 a.m, till 6 a.m. If you don't, if you have to go to work for something, do whatever kind of work you need to do so that you could do that work. Because we need that work. We need this, production of our life. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Harryette, the same question for you. What advice do you have?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with what Dionne has said. I would maybe add, you don't need permission.
Good one.
You give yourself permission.
Yeah.
You know that you have value, your life has value, your work has value, your voice has value. People might not even seem to value you. Some people, many writers and artists have not been valued until after they died. And sometimes they died, they were forgotten, and then someone found their work. And in a certain sense, resurrected the voice of someone who was long gone. So we don't know what effect our voice, our language, our work will have. We don't know. We can see a little bit, but we can't see the future and we can't see everything that's happening now. So we really don't know. But if we give ourselves permission, and I would say keep a journal. You don't have to be published. You don't have to be validated. You don't have to be praised. You don't have to be, get reviews. You can write just because you want to write, and you give yourself that permission.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is then a related question, getting into the nuts and bolts of language. We have a question about how you rejuvenate language and keep it fresh, and particularly how you re-energize language that's become inert or dead or tired. I'm thinking, Harryette, of Recyclopedia and the collections in that volume where you deal with a lot of wrote trite language and present it to us in completely unrecognizable ways. So, the question is, how can we create a new life through the invigoration of modern day habituated language?
I think sometimes it is a question of reading what has already been written and reading what's being written by your contemporaries, and having a sense that you're in conversation with the past, the present, and the future. A lot of times I do take things that we have heard before or we've read before, and I try to put a little spin on them. And I think that's so that we can hear it again. There are many things that we hear over and over again, but we don't really listen because we have heard them so many times. And so some of what I do is to make us really listen to those things that we hear every day, but we don't really listen to them.
So Dionne, if I could ask the same question, you take that adage, better to have lived and loved, and you present it to us in a completely new light in Ossuaries. So could you talk about that same question of
language,
inventing and refreshing?
Yeah. I totally understand the problem in a sense, because we are inundated with language, actually, right? On televisual screens, right? There is so much of it going out, so much content filling various kind of websites, etc. So much coming at you, so much advertising too. This is also a kind of awful poetry, but it is poetry, yeah. And, so it is a problem about how to make that, how to turn the register of that up to a point where it is new again, right? But here's the thing: we're surrounded by its becoming new. There's hip hop, there are songs, there's R&B, there are all kinds of production of language, right? In most agile and beautiful ways too, you know? And so I think sometimes it is just consider what alacrity that piece of music has. Consider, what is right around you. What are the tools right around you? You asked me earlier about the language of science. Well, it's all around us. We simply don't think that I should go put it in a poem or something. In fact, but I know many people who do, right? So it is something about that. It is how to make that, how to brighten those things up, how to brighten the materials of your life up to a kind of fineness. So about if I lived and loved, I cannot have lived. I think in the poem suggests not just a mere yearning for a kind of romantic love, but it's a challenge as to that very normative exclusivity and insularity of romantic love. How do we live in the world, right? How do you hear some massacre someplace, some war someplace, and then you desire something that completely obfuscates it? How do we live? And each day we live with that. And so the poet, the narrator, is troubled and arrested by that grim detail, that there could be a massacre somewhere, and yet I am living in the normative, if you will, right? Yeah. So that's the thing of poetry, I think, that breaking that language open. Okay, here's the answer. Okay, it's to break that language open. Yes, break that normative language open, and put two completely different things together and see what happens.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I want to sort of stick with this theme of refreshing language, brightening language, and taking two words that are so central to our theme for this week of a Black study, but which are very much in danger of becoming inert in our universities. I'm thinking of the nouns diversity and inclusion. So start by asking you, Harryette, they don't often make professors of poetry and creative writing provosts, but let's say we give you the chair of provost. You are the provost. How would you like to see serious Black study done in, let's say, we won't name names, but take a sort of figurehead American university, and what part would you have poetry play in diversity and inclusion initiatives? I'm laughing, but for me, it's a very serious question.
Well, let's see. I kind of think that that's what I'm doing. I've been teaching poetry and the courses in the English department that are sometimes cross-listed with African American studies. I've been teaching more and more poetry. And the poetry itself pulls in diverse groups of students. They come from they're not all English majors. They're not all wanting to be poets. Some of them love poetry, or they want to try poetry, see if they like it. Some of them want to write poetry. Some of them want to read poetry. So I think just the opportunity. One of the things that I guess is probably the difficulty that we're having now is the devaluation of the humanities in universities. The idea that we have become job training institutions, rather than having a different idea of what education is, what learning is, what study is. The certification of people for particular jobs is something that endangers humanities in general, and poetry in particular, or literature in particular. The arts can be commercialized. Poetry rarely is commercialized. When we talk about Los Angeles, we often say that Los Angeles has more artists per capita than New York. But when we say that, we're including Disney, we're including Warner Brothers, we're including Sony. We're including all of these movie making. Those are forms of art as well, but it's a very commercial kind of art. But that's one of the ways that Los Angeles continues to pay for the arts that don't make money.
You're absolutely right to point to your own practice and to say, the work that you are doing in the classroom in teaching poetry is poetry Black study at the heart of the university. I would like, if I was thinking very practically, I would like to set your essay published in 1999, imagining the unimagined reader writing to the unborn and including the excluded as required reading for every first year student coming into our universities. Because I think if you can do that work of imagining the unimagined reader and writing to the unborn, what can't you imagine or express, or what can't you reach? Dionne, so the same mischievous but serious question for you.
Well, I teach poetry and prose at my university. But I want to say that in terms of Black study in Canada, this is not this is a new concept, seriously, even though Black people have existed in this country for several centuries. But Black studies departments, or the idea of Black studies departments, are only now being kind of vaguely thought about. Though those universities have used the language of diversity and inclusion, it is now a kind of commercial language too, right? In order to fend off critique. But we will see what will happen in the future with that. I teach in an MFA program at the University of Guelph, and I always marvel at the student body and the interest in poetry and prose at this moment too, right? I mean, who was it? Adrienne Rich, I think, said that poetry is the least commoditized art. Thank God. At least we can still sort of speak in its expanse, you know, we can still speak in its width, and it doesn't have to be commoditized in those ways. So, I mean, I think we have to reconceive university anyway, reconceive academy, and that perhaps academy can occur outside of the university, you know, and at various points in Black struggle all over the world, that has happened. Mm-hmm. You know, I was born in Trinidad, and I recall in my childhood, Eric Williams, who wrote Capitalism and Slavery,
Square.
Right, speaking in a place called Woodford Square, and it becoming the University of Woodford Square, where night after night people would go and listen to him speak. So I think we have to reconceive the university, and reconceive the academy, what the academy is.
Momentous and portentous lines to end with. I think we are at the end of time. Can I thank you both so much for your readings and for the generosity of your engagement with my questions.
Thank you.
Audience questions.
Thank you so much.
To talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you. Lovely to meet you, Harriette.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I have to say that, you know, if the university weren't funding this, but still, it could still be a part of that kind of reinventing the university of which you speak, I hope, right? It kind of can be, but it's also funded by the university, so it's a little oxymoronic, but perhaps. I want to thank you all so much. I want to thank you, Harriette and Dionne and Emily. Emily, you've spent the whole day with us. Thank you so much. Thank you to our audience from around the world. This is exactly what we wanted to do when we talked about Black study. We actually wanted to use this moment when Angie Cruz and I first conceived of this idea of doing a week-long intensive Black study, use this moment of overlapping crises to do something that we couldn't do in other times, right? Mm-hmm. To kind of see it for what it is, but to also try to engage the opportunity that it might present us with. And so I want to thank you so much. This has been a historic evening. I'm a materialist, so I only believe in magic I experience. Please join us, everyone, tomorrow night for poet, performer, composer Jerome Ellis, cultural historian and writer Sadia Hartman, and poet essayist Erica Hunt. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dawn. Thank you.
Thank you so much.